All right, welcome everybody, and welcome to our November Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. This is always a free lecture series for members, and if you're here, we've got a couple people who bought the lecture. I want to welcome you and mention that if you can become a member of the Friends of the Cabildo. We've already started booking for January of 2026, and we already have three or four lectures, but we'll end up having about 15 to 20 lectures. Next per year. So do take advantage of that and become a member of the Friends of the Cabildo. Tonight, we're going to be talking with one of our great friends, former board member, former historian at the Louisiana State Museum, an adjunct professor at University of New Orleans, and going to be talking about his new book, New Orleans, A Concise History of an Exceptional City, Dr. Charles Chamberlain. And I hope you will enjoy what Charles has to say about the book. And Charles, welcome on the call, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jason, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I do recognize some names. Judy Penter was one of my former students out there. She may have even taken my New Orleans history course that I teach at UNO. So I just want to introduce the book here. I'll show you a shot of the cover there. It's a beautiful cover. LSU Press came up with the design. And at first, I pictured something very historic looking. And then they suggested this because they really wanted to create a trade book or tradey, as they say, and appeal to a broad audience. So they said, no, this cover is tradey. But I kind of love it now because I love the sunset image and the view of Jackson Square here. So St. Louis Cathedral, the Presbytere, and the Cabildo, and it means a lot to me personally because my office window in the Cabildo actually appears in the corner of that photo. So where the offices are at the State Museum. But anyway, Jason mentioned the title again, LSU Press. So the title is New Orleans: A Concise History of an Exceptional City. And the concise part is really intended to provide a comprehensive but short history of New Orleans, in part because I wrote this book because I'd heard from so many people, gosh, there needs to be a book that provides a complete history of New Orleans and is yet scholarly and also applies to a broad audience. And so that was my intention overall in creating this book. So I got my PhD from Tulane in 1999, worked for the Louisiana State Museum for 10 years, also as a tour guide, part of that, and then afterwards. And all of these years of experience of basically immersing myself in Louisiana history and New Orleans history gave me a strong foundation and base, I believe, for writing this book. And then, as I mentioned, Judy Penter's on this call, but Judy took my New Orleans history course at UNO, which I still teach. And so, really, the book is kind of a book version of the history course. And I'm going to go over the book in just a minute. But I also want to talk about the subtitle. So, the subtitle is A Concise History of an Exceptional City. So, concise history, I actually suggested short history is the New Orleans is a short history. LSU Press then said, no, let's call it concise and an exceptional city. But it is funny because the term exceptional, as applied to New Orleans, is somewhat controversial. And I will say that in my classes, when I discuss the issue of or raise the question of is New Orleans an exceptional city, the students are often divided and they say, no, we're so tired of the exceptionalism. New Orleans is just another American city. Or you have those people who really love the distinct culture here and they're like, no, it's very distinct. It is exceptional. It's so different from other places. So I encourage you all at the end of this talk to offer your own opinions on that subject. Is New Orleans exceptional? And indeed, in the introduction, this is part of what I discuss in the introduction, is I raise the question, is New Orleans exceptional? And what I basically argue is that within the United States, New Orleans is exceptional and not necessarily the best, but just different, or maybe distinct or distinctive is another word you could use. But I mean, I think we all know the anecdotes for how New Orleans is different from other places. Maybe you grew up someplace and moved to New Orleans and you're like, wow, they don't do it here like they do it there. So there's a long list of attributes and characteristics of New Orleans that do make it distinctive or exceptional. But my intention was not to say it is an exceptional city, but really just to raise the question to start a dialogue. And so that's one kind of cool thing I do appreciate about the title, the subtitle, is that people then are like, wow, exceptional. I don't know if it's exceptional or not. And then they start a conversation, which, as a historian, a conversation or a discussion is really the ultimate goal. Where if you have people talking about an issue and they talk back and forth and discuss all the different arguments and attributes, then that's half the game right now. And raising questions also is very important to me as a historian. Um, and I will provide one anecdote, which I think is funny, is I recently was texting with Tulane professor Matt Sakakini, who teaches in the music department at Tulane. He recently published a book, which I was not aware of until last week, but it has a similar color scheme in the cover, shows the river and the city in the background, and then the title is Beyond Exceptionalism. So when he texted me, he said, "Oh, I guess the argument is settled. New Orleans is exceptional." And I said, I laughed, and so we had a funny exchange about that. He knows me well enough to know that I wouldn't, basically come down on one side or the other. And really, I don't think neither does he. But again, it's this discussion that is the most interesting part about really acknowledging the distinctiveness of New Orleans. So, what I'd like to do is kind of give a broad overview about the book, talk about each chapter and maybe some stories from each chapter just to give y'all a sense of what I cover in the book. So, in the introduction, I basically look at the context in which New Orleans exists in South Louisiana, where it's viewed even as distinct in that area. And then I raise the question, is it New Orleans exceptional? And so certainly if you compare it to, say, Houston or Mobile or Baton Rouge, or I mean, the list goes on and on, New Orleans can be very distinct and different. But then I say that in the larger Creole world, and this is Le Monde Creole, which basically encompasses all of the Caribbean basin, most of eastern parts of Latin America, some western Latin America, all of the Atlantic basin, including West Africa, and then even going around to the Indian Ocean. This is the Creole world. And so part of the discussion is also defining Creole, which is a very difficult word to define. If y'all have seen some of my social media posts, I explore this subject overall. But just briefly, I will tell y'all that Creole, the term, was a Portuguese and Spanish term, criollo, which designated someone as born in the Americas. So it was basically shorthand for American. And then what you find is that in the 19th century in New Orleans, as the English-speaking Protestants move in to the city, the local French or Spanish-speaking Catholics, regardless of their ethnicity or background, viewed themselves as very different and distinct from the Americans. And so this characterization of a cultural divide between the Anglo-Protestant English-speaking Americans and the French-speaking Catholic Creoles characterizes the city's history, especially throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So basically making the argument that within the United States, New Orleans is exceptional based on its Creole culture. But then in the Monde Creole, the larger Creole world, New Orleans is one of many communities that share many attributes. And I mean, you could look at towns like Havana, Cuba, or Cartagena, Colombia, or Port-au-Prince, Haiti, or go over to West Africa and the Cape Verde area, or even La Réunion, the island in the southern Indian Ocean, also identifies as Creole. So it is interesting to really observe what communities around the world identify themselves as Creole. And I will say, just as a quick aside, that Richard Sexton wrote a book called The Creole World, and he really explores the Caribbean basin, I think mostly Haiti and Cuba. But I think it's very important to acknowledge this much broader definition of Creole. And it's an umbrella term that really applies to um, the creation of a local, distinct culture from all of the different peoples that moved to that colony, that specific location. And so in New Orleans, when we define Creole today, it's usually in terms of food, Creole gumbo, or architecture, Creole cottage, or language, the Creole language, and also people who identify as Creole. So again, this characterizes New Orleans within the United States. Um, but what I'd like to do is kind of go through the book chapter by chapter briefly to kind of highlight some of the stories which I think are important. So, chapter 1 is called Bulbancha, and this is the Choctaw term for the location of what would become New Orleans. And the translation is the place of many tongues. In other words, basically a market area, a meeting ground where people come from around the region, and that includes all of North America and parts of the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast, and they meet and generally trade. So New Orleans still holds this characteristic today, which I think is very fascinating. Even before the French colonialists arrived, Native Americans would meet and exchange and trade and speak a common language, which they could agree on. Probably the Mobilian language, that was the lingua franca of that time. But it's also very, let me just back up and say that Alexander de Botts, if I can find this picture, depicted a market in New Orleans in 1735. Here, I'll show you all this. The original's in color. It's from Harvard Peabody Museum. It's an amazing image of this market in New Orleans. And basically what de Botts does is he shows that some of the people come from the Great Lakes region, some of the people come from the outer Gulf Coast region, the Attakabaw people. There's a black person of unknown origin. There's a Fox woman slave. So the Fox people coming from the Great Lakes region. So at the bottom of this illustration, it's a very famous illustration by Alexander de Botts again, he inscribes the location as Bulbancha, Fleuve de Mississippi. So basically acknowledging that this area on the lower Mississippi is known as Bulbancha, the place of many tongues. But in terms of, sorry, my phone is ringing. In terms of the location of New Orleans, I do like to point out that in 2018, the 300th anniversary of the founding of New Orleans, there were many indigenous scholars who pointed out that Bulbancha existed before La Nouvelle Orleans. So I think it's very important to acknowledge the indigenous presence before the French came and all of the cultural contributions that indigenous people have made to our culture and our society. One of the interesting questions I have is when Iberville came to the location of the French Quarter in 1699, he acknowledges that the area of the French Quarter was a former village of the Quinipissa people who had cleared the land for farming. And then he says that the trees had grown back 2 feet in diameter. So that's about like this, right? I often ask people, how long does it take a pioneering species tree like a red maple or a willow to grow into 2 feet diameter in South Louisiana? It actually doesn't take long. It takes maybe 10 or 15 years. So my guess is the Quinipissa had abandoned that site 15 years before. Why did they abandon it? We'll never know. Many of these indigenous communities were not meant to be permanent. It was kind of the nature of indigenous settlement to basically settle one area and move around and then maybe go back to that area. So nothing was really permanent. But I also wonder whether it was the annual spring flood that really drove people off of those lands. And this comes from a personal experience that probably everyone's had of having to endure a flood in South Louisiana, whether it's a tide surge or a street flood from a monsoon type rain. It can be stressful and traumatic. And generally, a lot of families say, well, I do not want to go through that again. Let's move. So I imagine the Quinipissa having this conversation. Do we stay here and endure the spring floods every year, or are y'all ready to move on? So obviously they had abandoned it. And so that brings up chapter one. And also, I do want to bring up that each chapter includes specific historical sites that I encourage people to visit, and also a recipe that is relevant to the particular time period or subject, which I encourage people to make, to basically imbibe in the culture and taste the culture by cooking these historic recipes. So for chapter one, I include the recipe for corn makshu, which is often identified as a Cajun corn stew, but actually has indigenous origins, as do all corn-based meals in the Americas. And then moving on to chapter two covers the French colonial period, and that is the La Village Creole, the Creole village. And indeed, in the French period, the population only got to about 3,000 people, really only 2,500 people, which by today's standards, anything under 3,000 is a village. So France did not really succeed in creating a thriving colonial settlement. Their intent was to create a permanent capital on the lower river and then basically engineer its survival and sustainability. So, one of the most important takeaways about the French establishing this settlement is the essential need for engineering to allow people to live there, and that, of course, includes levees, drainage canals, and then in the more modern period, pumping systems. And without those, we would be flooded every spring and it would be very traumatic. So also in chapter two, the French period, I do want to point out two stories which I think are interesting. On the one is Madame Réal, who is explored in Shannon Downey's Building the Devil's Empire and other books. But she is basically a French woman from Bordeaux, France, who comes as an indentured servant into a society that based on French standards, has kind of a closed caste system, not a lot of social mobility. But by her death in the mid 1700s, her accession, which you can find at the notarial archives, indicates that she died a wealthy woman. So it's really a remarkable story about a woman who had nothing from France, who came over and then ends up dying as one of the wealthiest women in town. And she lived at Madame John's Legacy, the beautiful French residence that is now part of the State Museum system on Dumaine Street. So Madame Marion is an example of the social mobility that did occur in French colonial Louisiana. The second person is Jean-Baptiste Sieur de Bienville. Y'all know is the founder of the town. I will just make one comment that I think is interesting, is that he was born in Montreal. His dad, Charles Lemoyne, was one of the founders of Montreal. And then, of course, Bienville founded New Orleans in 1718, and he was governor 4 times in Louisiana. But in the 1740s, he retired to Paris. So I often ask people, would you want to live in New Orleans in the 1740s or Paris? And of course, most people say New Orleans was a pretty hard life in the 1740s. Paris would be much easier. So I don't blame Bienville for moving there and retiring there. I think it's a funny story. Who would want to live a hard life in New Orleans in the 1740s if you get to have a better life in Paris? All right. Then moving on to chapter 3, which is the Spanish period. So Spain takes over Louisiana when France gives control to avoid Louisiana falling in the hands of Great Britain after the 7 Years' War Treaty of Paris. So a couple people that I think are interesting in the Spanish chapter are Père Antoine, the famous pastor of St. Louis Cathedral, and also San Malo, who was a leader of the African Maroon community. So on the one hand, Père Antoine is really a remarkable figure in New Orleans history. He basically arrives as a Capuchin priest to enforce the Inquisition around 1780 or mid 1770s. But can you imagine trying to enforce the Inquisition in New Orleans? You would basically get rid of half the population. Spain did not want that to occur. So basically, the King Carlos III gave an order that says we are not going to enforce the Inquisition. But Père Antoine maintains a controversial life throughout his life, in part because people are somewhat suspicious of him as a priest, and this comes from a number of sources. But what is fascinating about him in the long run is in 1803, when the United States takes over Louisiana, the congregation at St. Louis Cathedral votes to retain him as pastor and forego the pastor sent by the Archdiocese of Baltimore. If you know anything about the Catholic Church, there is no democracy in the congregation. So the basically the implementation of some kind of democratic vote in St. Louis Church, St. Louis Cathedral, is quite interesting. And then he dies in 1829, so his career is about 60 years in New Orleans. There's much more to his story that I won't cover here today, but I encourage you all to check it out in the book. And then San Malo he represents the African maroon communities which existed in the 1780s especially. And this are basically self-emancipated African people that then live in the swamp. So San Malo started a community on Bayou San Malo in St. Bernard Parish off of Lake Borgne. He was eventually arrested by the Spanish troops under Governor Miro and then executed on Jackson Square. But on the one hand, he represents this issue of marronage, which existed all around New Orleans and South Louisiana, not often talked about in history. And in many ways, he serves as a hero to the oppressed who had avoided oppression and been able to find their own freedom in the wilderness and survive. And also in terms of food, the recipes, I forgot to mention chapter 2 has a recipe for jambalaya, which is a tribute to the Senegalese West African roots of that dish as riz jollof or jollof rice, whatever you want to call it. Also very similar to paella. And then in chapter 3, the recipe is stuffed peppers. And I'll ask y'all, how many of y'all grew up eating stuffed peppers in New Orleans? And what do you use for your filling? So it's a classic New Orleans dish, much like jambalaya. A lot of people add rice to their peppers. But it's a way to basically pay tribute to the Spanish dish of rellenos, pimientos rellenos, and then also the existence of stuffed peppers as a meal throughout the Mediterranean basin. So really acknowledging the Mediterranean influence on New Orleans in the Spanish period. Moving on to chapter 4. Which is the early American period, so really from the Louisiana Purchase 1803 to the American Civil War. A couple interesting people I would bring up are William Claiborne, and y'all know him as the governor. I think he's an interesting case study in terms of the cultural divisions and the attempts to overcome those cultural divisions at the time. And this is a time period when the Creole-American divide was strongest. It was reflected in newspapers, theaters, language, foodways, and the list goes on, and geography as well. Uptown was generally American, downtown was generally Creole. But Claiborne started off as a Virginian immigrant who didn't speak French, and the Creoles resented him. He eventually marries into the Bosque family, which was a prominent Spanish family in New Orleans. And then endears himself to the Creole community so that by the time of the first state election, he actually beats Jacques Villeray, a local Creole, based on his record and the people's love for him. So I find that very interesting. Also, in this time period of chapter 4, I find it interesting the story of Margaret Howery, who's an Irish immigrant who becomes very successful as a business owner, owning a bakery, and then becomes one of the greatest philanthropists of the 19th century. She's somehow overlooked, but there is the statue to her at the Margaret Place, basically at Calliope in Britannia. And what I think is interesting about her is this is a time period when the Irish were considered the lowest of the European immigrants, the lowest of the low-wage workers, looked down upon, looked as savage or backwards. And here she is, an Irish woman who feeds the city, provides money to fund orphanages for all of the people left in the wake of the massive yellow fever epidemics that claimed the city, including 1853, probably the most deadly epidemic, which kills around 8,000 people, a tenth of the city's population. And so for chapter 4, I actually choose the recipe for Creole coubillon. And this is to talk about the creolization of other foodways in Louisiana. So, making the point that a French courte bouillon is basically a French seafood dish where you boil the fish very quickly or shortly. Courte, short, bouillon, boil. In New Orleans, it becomes known as coubillon, and many of y'all probably have cooked coubillon or grew up eating it, and it's basically made with kind of a tomato gravy, almost a roux, that you would add the catch of the day to. So it's basically kind of a tomato-based fish stew, in my opinion. And some of y'all may have your own different recipes or opinions. Um, I will say that also in New Orleans, and I'm sorry, in South Louisiana, that many people actually don't make a big distinction between coubillon and bouillabaisse. And bouillabaisse is a historic fish stew from the Marseille region, similar to our own gumbo. So I'll be curious to know if anyone has an opinion on coubillon and what defines it. And then chapter 5 covers the end of the 19th century. So that's from the Civil War, 1860, all the way to 1910. And I have a couple figures that I think are very interesting in terms of reflecting the distinctiveness of this time period. One is Lafcadio Hearn. Y'all are probably very familiar with him. He's the writer of Greek and Irish origins who grew up in Cincinnati but was attracted to the romance and the exoticism of New Orleans and came here. And he's considered really kind of the first folklorist of Creole culture, going around and documenting proverbs and recipes and stories and anecdotes or any story. And so it's quite remarkable that he was so forward thinking and entranced by the exoticism of New Orleans Creole culture that he achieves this fact. And he stays 10 years. And then, as kind of a restless soul, he moves on to Martinique and then ends up settling in Japan, all kind of viewing what's the next exotic location that I can move to. And then another interesting figure from this time period is Rodolphe Desdunes, who's a Creole of color historian. He wrote a book called, in French, Notre Histoire, Notre Homme, basically Our History and Our Men, or Our People. And he documents Creole culture as well. This is at a time period during the first initial steps at formal legal segregation, in which white Creoles, like Charles Garret, the famous New Orleans historian, basically say only French descendants can call themselves Creole. Garret called people like Desdunes mulatto. So Desdunes pushes back. He's like, no, we are in fact Creole. We've always identified as Creole. And here is a history of our people and all the accomplishments that we made. And then ending the two stories of Hearn and Desdunes, it's very interesting that both of them left the city. Hearn in this quest for exoticism, but Desdunes really to escape the racial tensions, the oppression of segregation that existed in his lifetime. And he had been on the front lines of the civil rights cause, been a big supporter of Plessy versus Ferguson, the civil rights case that was basically ruled by the Supreme Court to make segregation legal. So he becomes very disenchanted with New Orleans, moves to Omaha, Nebraska to live with his son, Dan Desdunes, who's an accomplished musician. The Desdunes family actually has a number of figures in the family that are important in jazz history. So that's chapter 5. And again, it's kind of in the context of the fading Creole culture, but the fact that Hearn and Desdunes and others acknowledge the existence of this culture and try to document it. Chapter 6 covers the time period from 1910 to 1950. So really the birth of jazz, and the chapter is titled The Birthplace of Jazz. The main central figure for this chapter is, not surprisingly, Louis Armstrong, who his autobiography, Satchel in My Life in New Orleans, offers an amazing snapshot portrait of New Orleans during this time period. And Louis is in many ways an embodiment of the city. He grows up, of course, as a poor young African American man. He becomes the most recognized entertainer and face internationally after World War II, and actually gives back into the community in many ways. So Louis Armstrong's very important, and I follow a lot of his anecdotes to explore the history during this time period. Another person I think is very important during this time period is Sam Zamuri, the founder of United Fruit. So he is a Jewish immigrant from Moldova who basically pioneers and expands the banana trade, starting out in Alabama and moving to New Orleans. And basically, him and the Vaccaro brothers of Standard Fruit make New Orleans the largest hub of fruit import and export in the world at that time. So, quite a remarkable story. And then also, Zamuri's involvement in the politics of Central America to create an atmosphere favorable to his company leads to the term Banana Republic. So New Orleans will always be affiliated with the Association of the United States meddling in especially Latin American nations to create a favorable economic and political environment for American companies. And also in terms of recipes, chapter 5, I forgot to mention, has grilled oysters representing the Croatian immigration. Of course, Mediterranean immigration is a major theme of that chapter, Sicilians especially. But I chose grilled oysters to represent Croatian Creole, as I call it. And then chapter 6 has red beans and rice. And I don't use Louis Armstrong's recipe exactly, but I do include it in the footnotes. And so if anyone is interested, by the way, Louis Armstrong was generally obsessed with red beans throughout his whole life. It was his trademark. And him and his last wife, Lucille, submitted their recipe. And then Camellia Red Beans on their website now puts it online for anyone to follow. And it's a great recipe. It uses a number of different pork flavors. So I guarantee if you make it, you won't regret it. All right, moving on to the last couple chapters. Chapter 7 covers 1950 to 2005, so Hurricane Katrina. During this time period, I think a couple of the figures that I think are remarkable would include Mayor Vic Schiro, who may be overlooked today, but his legacy is huge in what he did to modernize the city and also bring it to its current level of tourism and infrastructure. And just to give you an idea, it was his idea to recruit NASA to come to New Orleans. So helping expand New Orleans east and providing, modern jobs during the Cold War era. He also helped build the Superdome with Dave Dixon, floating a bond that provided money for that. He also helped recruit the Saints with Dave Dixon. He expanded Poydras Avenue. He wanted to build, along with the Department of Transportation, the Riverfront Expressway, which would be a giant double-decker elevated expressway in the front of the French Quarter along the river. Preservationists fought against that, and New Orleans was really the first city in the United States to actually cancel a Department of Transportation plan in the era of the interstate system. But on the other hand, they did complete I-10 down the Claiborne corridor, down the North Claiborne corridor. Very controversial still today. So basically coming right down the heart of Treme, which is considered the main Black business district in the downtown area. And the person that I associate with this fight and this legacy is Leah Chase. So Leah Chase, the great chef, owner, co-owner with her husband Dookie of Dookie Chase Restaurant on Orleans. They were kind of quiet civil rights activists where they would use the Camelback Room at Dookie Chase to basically have meetings between city leaders and civil rights activists to try to resolve any issues. And they also tried to fight the I-10 corridor coming down Claiborne Avenue. Because if you look at the pictures of Claiborne Avenue back in the day, it was a beautiful park with big live oaks. And it was a real shame that I-10 came through there. But anyway, Leah Chase has her great legacy as not only a great chef, of which I think many of y'all have appreciated her, but also important in the civil rights movement. And then moving on to, The recipe that I include for chapter 7 is banh mi, the classic Vietnamese po' boy, acknowledging the important immigration of Vietnamese people to New Orleans at this time, and also the coalescence of a kind of French Creole and Vietnamese traditions. And that is, a banh mi is like a po' boy. It uses a pistolet loaf, but much like our New Orleans French bread, it's a very light and flaky loaf that you bite into, and the bread just, bites into very easily, and it's all flaky and has a great taste. And then also the way that people add jalapenos and hot sauce is very much a South Louisiana. And then the recipe also uses grilled pork, which I say is a standard dish throughout South Louisiana, especially on Sundays when you drive through Cajun country. Grilled pork is everywhere. So that's chapter 7. And so basically, this chapter is called America's Most Interesting City, looking at New Orleans' continuing distinctiveness into the late 20th century. And then moving on to chapter 8, it's called Ain't Dare No More, taken from the Benny Grunch and the Bunch song about the changes that have come to the city really since the 1990s. And so a couple figures that I would highlight in terms of this chapter is, on the one hand, Bunny Matthews, who's the cartoonist and comedian, who came up with the Vic and Natalie series, basically kind of acknowledging or attributing or documenting the existence of New Orleans Yat culture. So it's very interesting. Nowadays, people talk about Yat all the time, but really it was during this time period in the 1970s that Yat culture really came into prominence, and then became kind of a badge of pride for many people, including Benny Grunch and the Bunch, as they use kind of an exaggerated Yat dialect in their songs. Ain't there no more, like that. Um, and then let's see who else. Oh, Miss Linda. So in this chapter, I include the recipe for Yacamine to represent what I would call the gentrification of New Orleans food, and that is the Yacamine soup dish, which up until Katrina, you could find generally at maybe second lines or at corner stores in African American neighborhoods, but it wasn't really a mainstream dish. You would also find it at Chinese restaurants. As an aside, my UNO student Winston Ho has done a lot of work on the history of Yacamine. Shout out to Winston on that. But Miss Linda is considered now the great face or spokesperson for the Yacamine tradition. She still lives on Washington Avenue near LaSalle, around the corner from the Dewdrop. And one of the first times I met her was actually at the Louisiana State Museum. But a wonderful lady, very nice, and a great entrepreneur who has really elevated the exposure of Yacamine, but also at the time reflecting the gentrification of this dish. Is now it's mainstream. You may even find it in really nice restaurants. You find it everywhere. Recipes are everywhere. People have this longing for Yacamine now, which started out as kind of an Asian noodle soup and now has grown into a New Orleans iconic dish. And then lastly, I'll end up here, and this is the epilogue. And I raised the question in the epilogue, where will we celebrate the quadricentennial of New Orleans? And that is the 400th anniversary in 2118. And again, I'm raising a question. I'm not making a statement, but again, I do this to create a dialogue about how people envision the future of the city. And I know y'all are very well aware of all of the challenges that the city faces. I make the claim that in the future, New Orleans may look like Venice, Italy, and that is more of an island, susceptible to flooding on a regular basis. Really, only the wealthiest people can afford to live there. All the service workers basically have to commute in from farther away. It's big site for carnival and costuming, and also known for its food and drink. So many similarities between New Orleans and Venice. Do I know where we'll celebrate? I certainly don't. I hope we can celebrate it on the terroir of New Orleans. And I will kind of conclude my talk here by saying that I find the location of New Orleans to be a distinct location in terms of being the birthplace of many cultural phenomenon. But I will raise the question to you all. Do you think that the earth, the exact location of New Orleans is so important that it will be difficult to transfer New Orleans cultural traditions to another place as people migrate out over time due to all these challenges? So, with that, I will conclude and we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple questions here, Charles. If anybody else any other questions, please put them in the chat. Speaking of cuisine, I'm sure you saw that the Michelin Guide was just announced, and we got the most. We were the only one with a 2-star, and we had 2 1-stars as well. What is did you talk a little bit about the dining culture in New Orleans? I'm sure other places had great restaurants. That's not debating anything, but it seems that um, New Orleans people love talking about their dinner, where they're going to dinner while they're eating at lunch.
Yeah,
Why
that's a
is it,
great.
why has dining always been so big here?
I would say it's a worshiping of food in general that probably reflects strongly our French heritage. And that is, if you know, I mean, in Spanish too, in certain African nations as well. But if you know, if you're at a dinner in France and you bring up a subject of, what are the best cheeses or how do you make a bouillabaisse in Marseille, you could go on for hours, people talking about this, and people love to talk about it. In New Orleans, it's the same way. You ask people, how do you make a roux? Or, what color roux do you make? Or do you add tomatoes to jambalaya? I mean, there's a number of questions you could ask in regards to our food heritage. But yeah, I'd say New Orleans is very similar to that general dynamic of an obsession and a love of food. And then back to your original statement, in chapter 6, which is the early American chapter. Sorry, hold on a sec. Chapter 4, the early American chapter, I do talk about the birth of food tourism. And so New Orleans, again, this is very distinct. New Orleans emerges internationally as a destination for food tourism in the early 19th century. It's quite remarkable. So you have restaurants like Antoine's or Arnaud's or Tujague's. And Tujague's actually started out as Madame Begay's Coffee Exchange, which is known as essentially the originator of American brunch. And so she's considered by many historians to be the first celebrity chef. And the American brunch actually has its roots in Central Europe as basically a late morning meal for working people where they would have their breakfast before they go to work. And then by around 11, they're hungry and they want a late breakfast. So she comes from that tradition, which still exists in parts of Central Europe, especially Germany. So that's kind of the short answer. And then also, what we find is in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we have a number of other restaurants that become famous. And this includes, say, Fabbacher's restaurant. And then also, it's important to note that Antoine's and Arnaud's both are really the 2 longest existing restaurants in the city, as far as I know. I know Antoine's is for sure. So that is really something in the city's culinary historical legacy. Another interesting story I would like to bring out in terms of food history that I do talk about in chapter 7, and that is the story of the Brennan family, and especially Ella Brennan. So the Brennan family, of course, they were Irish from the Irish Channel. They said, you know what, we're going to open up a Creole restaurant in the French Quarter, and we're going to show the world that Irish Americans know how to cook. And so, of course, the Brennan family is internationally famous today, but I really have to give a shout out to Ella Brennan. If you see the movie A Table of Her Own, it explains her life story. But she hired Paul Prudhomme and God, what am I thinking of? The
Emerald.
chef over on River Frank Bryston, and then Emeril Lagasse. So these chefs that went on to become very famous, and also basically kind of reinvent Louisiana food in the new American genre. That is to use local, fresh, seasonal ingredients to define your food. So I'll kind of end there in terms of talking about culinary tourism.
Um, and if you're ever looking for something interesting, on the Friends of the Cabildo website, we actually have, if you click on oral histories, we have an oral history, I think from the 80s, that's been digitized of Ella Brennan. And to give you a quick snippet of it, it stops in the middle because one of the guys who was cleaning the floors didn't get one spot. So they stop the oral history. She goes over there, picks it up, puts it in there, tells them don't miss any spots, and then they start back up again. So we have a wonderful oral history program which talks about that. So that's on our website on the main page. Petra says, would you consider the Ursuline Convent open to girls and women of all colors and classes the longest continuous education for women in the United States as an example of New Orleans exceptionalism?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I'd say exceptionalism in terms of the origin of the founding. It's so far before other all-girls schools that it really represents our rich French tradition. So the Ursuline school opened in what, 1727 or something like that, when the
Yeah,
Ursuline
next year's
nuns
the
came.
300th anniversary, or 2017, 2027 is the 300th
Okay,
anniversary.
right. And so I think it does represent exceptionalism. And what is unique about those early years is, hey, it was an integrated school. They had indigenous and African and French girls all working together or learning together. But in fact, if you read the accounts of the nuns' view towards some of these students, they expected the African girls to stay and serve them, which basically meant live as enslaved people. So there is a kind of a double or triple standard there in the school. But overall, the intent to educate all women is really admirable, and says a lot about the priorities of the town. I will add that another one of the major themes that come throughout the book is this dichotomy of desire and piety, which characterizes the kind of the two different sides of the city. So a lot of New Orleans is known for its desire, its love of debauchery, decadence, love of partying and celebration. And then the Ursulines also represent the importance of piety and faith in the city's history overall. And if y'all are interested in reading more about this, Emily Clark's book, Masterless Mistresses, is an excellent historiographical, interpretive account. And then also, she edited the letters of Marie Madeleine Hachard, who was an Ursula nun who wrote letters to her dad in the 1720s, which really provide a personal view of that experience. So, yeah, Petra, thank you for raising that question.
One thing you do mention, which kind of in our current political landscape, is the high quality of mayors we've had over the years. I mean, when you tell people that, at this time we only have had one mayor in our history who's ever gone to jail, probably most people look at you and say that's got to be completely false. But can you just talk a little bit about, at least about a little bit more about the 20th century mayors and their visions they saw? And I mean, obviously Skiro was really big, but Chet Morrison was another one that was a really important mayor and went on to bigger and better things as well.
Yeah. So in the big picture, really during the colonial period, there was no position of mayor. In the French period, they had the superior council. In the Spanish period, they had the cabildo, which were like town councils that made decisions and laws. So beginning in the American period, this model of American democracy with a mayoral leadership is applied. And so really throughout the 19th century, there are some important mayors, but none in my mind that are so individual in terms of making a huge mark on the city. I will say that it's very interesting because in the 1830s, the Americans are so upset by Creole participation in politics that they basically get the city council to divide the city into three different sections, first, second, and third municipalities, so that the Americans can basically have their own administrated section uptown above Canal Street. And that ends in 1850. I think it goes from 1836 to 1852 when they again unite the city. So in terms of mayorship, again, the mayors are going to reflect kind of this back and forth between Americans and French and Creoles. And there were actually, I think, three French-born mayors in the early 19th century, not even Creoles, which is interesting. In the 20th and 21st century, Jason, you're right. There are a number of mayors who are very important. I don't really talk about the impact of Mayor Walmsley, even though I do think he's important. But I do go more into depth about Mayor Morrison and then Mayor Skiro and a little bit on Mayor Landrieu. That's the first Moon Landrieu. So Shep Morrison is interesting because on the one hand, he's elected after World War II as a reformer. So he's ready to take the city back in the name of reform from the Longites, who were led by Robert Maestri during the 1930s and up to World War II. And so he's a clean cut, good looking young veteran. But at the same time, he upholds the system of segregation. Whereas the world was modernizing and segregation was falling, Morrison was a segregationist to the end. And he left in 1961 when he was appointed by President Kennedy to be ambassador to the, I think it was called the Association of the Americas. But anyway, basically a diplomat for Latin America. He was replaced by Vic Skiro. I mentioned the accomplishments that Vic Skiro made, a huge legacy in terms of changing tourism in the city. And that also continues under Moon Landrieu. A couple interesting things that Moon Landrieu did that I think have an impact is it was under his administration that courted all the major hotel chains to build the big towers on Canal Street, which of course expanded tourism, in some ways made New Orleans more family friendly. And then also he removed the wharf in front of Jackson Square to create the Moonwalk, which basically enabled tourists to actually access the river. Ari Kelman, in his book A River in Its City, basically says that the dock board around 1900 just built the wharf sheds all along the river to completely cut it off from any kind of public interaction. So by the 1970s, 1976 is when the Moonwalk opened. Tourists then could access the river. And on a personal note, I grew up in Houston, but I remember coming to New Orleans in 1978, just 2 years after the Moonwalk opened. I remember crawling under a train to get to the river. For some reason, there was a train stalled in front of the Moonwalk. But I remember, being really impressed as a 12-year-old, this opportunity to experience the Mississippi right on the banks. And that was very cool. Also during this time is efforts by the business community worked with Landrieu to expand tourism. And this brings about the 1984 World's Fair, where the idea is to use the fair to spur renovation of the neglected warehouse district, which was really used for cotton exports in the 19th century. And so that's a huge legacy in terms of transforming the warehouse into kind of a derelict neighborhood into one that now one could argue has some of the nicest hotels and some of the nicest restaurants. Property values soared. And that was also continued under Mayor Dutch Morial, who was mayor during the 1984 World's Fair. So another mayor who we might mention is, of course, Ray Nagin, who was in kind of disbelief when Max Mayfield told him on August 27th, 2005, you have to issue a mandatory evacuation to the city. It had never been done before. And then, of course, after Katrina, Mayor Nagin appears somewhat hapless by today's standards, but he will admit that when Russell Honore arrived with the U.S. Army to take over the city, that he called him the John Wayne dude, basically acknowledging what New Orleans needed at that time and that Nagin was incapable of providing. So I'll kind of keep that short and leave it at there.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. I'll be sending a recording afterwards. Oh, wait, Margaret says, I may ask one more. I have many books dealing with New Orleans history. Looking forward to a concise history to pull everything together, and sounds like a fascinating book, but can't wait to get it. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, love New Orleans, visit often, and yes, y'all, New Orleans is exceptional. There you go, Charles.
Cool.
Need to reprint the book and take that and put that right on the back.
Yeah, I will say that it's kind of funny that you mentioned Cleveland because I do mention in the one part of the late 20th century that there's a T-shirt that has a quote credited to Tennessee Williams, which has said, "In the United States, there's New Orleans, San Francisco, New York. Everything else is Cleveland," which I think is a little bit unfair for Cleveland. But it makes the point that New Orleanians view themselves as exceptional and different and special. And I think that says a lot about themselves. A lot of other cities you go to, and no one would have this kind of pride of distinctiveness or exceptionalism. So, Margaret, I appreciate that comment, and I hope you enjoy the book. I will also say that it was partly through the inspiration of Jason specifically and other people at the Friends of Cabildo who really spurred me on to write this, partly because I was involved in tour guide training, and people kept saying there really needs to be a book that will help tour guides understand the history of the city, the comprehensive history of the city, but in a concise form. And so, again, this is my intention. So I hope y'all are able to get a copy and enjoy reading. So thank you all for attending tonight. It means a lot to me to see you all out there, and especially people like Judy, my former students, and everyone else who is attending. So thank you so much for doing that. Jason, you too.
Yeah, and one quick plug, Charles is actually going to be adding, we'll be having our carnival class in mid-January, maybe to early January. And Charles is going to be doing, which we've never done before, is going to be doing a history of Mardi Gras music. So we're going to have the origins of Carnival, Black Carnival. We'll have Cajun Mardi Gras. We'll have Gay Carnival, and we're adding this year with the history of throws, and we're adding this year the Mardi Gras music. Charles wanted to do it, and he said last year he wanted to do it and we didn't get around to it, but this year he's going to be able to do it. Sometimes I wonder if Charles just chooses he wants to do the work because he wants to know more about it. So, and that's really
That's
what it comes
partly
to.
true.
And let's be honest here, there's a lot of great Mardi Gras music, so it's all going to be a lot of fun. So if you're looking for some carnival history of carnival classes, we're adding new pieces if you've been on it before. So we'll see Charles again soon. And then obviously he always does our neighborhoods of New Orleans class. So
And the symposium.
and that's right. And we'll have our symposium on the role of Spanish colonial Louisiana and its role in the American Revolution, which is actually very, very important in the grand scheme of things. And that's December 12th or 13th. And we'll have it in person and on Zoom. So you'll be able to do both if you're like Margaret and you're in a Cleveland, you can watch it that way. But as always, these are always recorded and they're sent to you the next day. And I will include in there the discounted book so you can take advantage of that through the 1850 house. So with that, I want to thank Charles so much for doing the lecture tonight. And I want to thank you all for supporting the Friends of the Cabildo. We have great programming and I hope you take advantage of it. So New Orleans, a concise history of an exceptional city. Thanks, Charles.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone. Y'all have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.